Hi everyone, this is 8th grade Elevate, and today we are solving one-step algebraic equations. So this will be a nice refresher because students have worked on this skill a few weeks ago. So you shouldn't spend too much time modeling this lesson. The key pieces to remember are that when we are solving equations, we have to use inverse operations in order to isolate the variable, right? So addition undoes subtraction, subtraction undoes addition, multiplication undoes division, and division undoes multiplication, right? So here are, for your own internalization, here are 4 different examples on how to use each of the operations to isolate the variable. What will be new learning for students is that in previous lessons, they have only focused on one-step equations. Today, they are going to be exposed to two-step equations. And so in order to isolate the variable, they may need to do a combination of inverse operations. And so, for instance, in this example right here, we have 8v plus 5 is equal to 13. And in order to get that v by itself, students will have to first identify what operations are being highlighted within this problem. So we see multiplication and we also see addition. So we know that the inverse operations that we are going to use in order to isolate the variable have to be division to undo this multiplication, as well as subtraction to undo this addition. Now we have to consider order of operations. So the first operation that we are going to do is subtraction. So instead of adding 5, we are going to subtract 5 from both sides. When we do that, we are left with 8v on the left-hand side, and then because 13 minus 5 is 8, we will have 8 on the right-hand side. Note that the v is still not isolated. It is still being connected to the 8 by way of multiplication. And so in order to undo that, we have to divide by 8 on both sides. So when we divide by 8 on both sides, we end up with v is equal to 1. So when you jump into your model today, and you will have 3 models, only about 6 minutes. We're going to move fast only because we want students to get as much practice as possible with this skill. So as mentioned, we always want to figure out which operations are being performed in the equation. So in this equation, you may want to ask students, what operations do you see in this equation? Students should identify multiplication as well as subtraction. So it says identify the second operation, which is the subtraction, and then use the inverse operation of that on both sides. So because we subtracted negative 50, we would have to add 50 on both sides, right? If I had negative 50 and then I added 50 on the left-hand side, those cancel out and I'm just left with 5q. However, on the right-hand side, when I have 25 plus 50, I end up with 75. So my new equation becomes 5q is equal to 75. That is still an issue for us because we know that that q is not isolated. Our goal today is to isolate the variables, right? The q is still being connected to the 5 by way of multiplication. So in order to undo that, we need to divide by 5 on both sides, right? If I had 5 being multiplied and then I divided that 5, I'm just going to be left with Q. However, 75 divided by 5 is then 15. So we get Q is equal to 15. Then you are going to model for students. This is a one-step equation. You might want to start here, only because this is an example. These two questions actually are examples that students may be familiar with because they have already practiced one-step equations before you jump into this model here. And so from there, students are going to start their 10 minutes of practice. Questions 1 through 4 are all one-step equation practice, so they should not struggle. However, when it comes to this latter half of the practice, this is where they start to see those two-step equations, particularly in these two questions. Students may struggle. Students will have to highlight the distributive property first before they're able to do anything else. And in this question, students may get tripped up because they're seeing terms as their numerator, two terms as their numerator, and then a denominator. So support them in being able to identify the different operations that they're seeing in this problem in order to be successful. However, these two questions are scaffolded, so students should be able to productively struggle through it with a partner. And then in this part of the practice, there's a mix of one-step equations and two-step equations before launching students into their exit ticket. Again, a mix of one-step and two-step equations. We'll give them 2 points for each of the questions, 1 point for them using the right inverses and showing their work, and then the second point for getting the right answer.